This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Lots of stories to get to in our conversation here on the culture from a Christian worldview in this week's program. A lot of them having to do with what's happening in the political theater in America. Two big stories this week. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on DACA. Basically, what are we going to do with those that are known as the Dreamers, people who have been brought to the United States as children of illegal immigrants and not by any choice of their own. We were pushing about 700,000 of those in the U.S. This has been a political football that's gone back and forth. We did a Breakpoint commentary on it this week, and I want to get to that in just a second. But I think, Shane, we should probably, and I think at some level, if you dig deep enough, there's some things that these two stories have in common, and that is the impeachment hearings for President Trump were underway with an awful lot of media coverage and noise this week. And, look, are we going to learn anything new in these impeachment hearings? I don't think so. Again, just like has been said throughout the entire coverage of this story since it broke, one side saying, hey, there's nothing here, there's nothing illegal here, this is the way presidents talk to other presidents, and this is all kind of expected, and the other side basically claiming breaking news that there was an additional phone call the next day. Are we really going to learn anything new from these impeachment hearings? I think the answer right now is probably no.
So we're going to start by addressing both the elephant and the donkey in the room. Is that what you're saying, John?
I see what you did there. Very clever. I like that.
Thank you. Well, if I remember correctly, John, there have only been two presidents in U.S. history who've been impeached. It was Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. And no president has ever been convicted by the Senate, which is really what removes a president from office according to the Constitution. So the likelihood of President Trump getting removed from office, especially by a Republican-controlled Senate, at this stage seems pretty slim. But I think the thing worth talking about isn't the political shape of the whole situation, but the moral shape of the whole situation, like what's going on before us and how our public life is being transformed. I think many Americans have this unspoken sense or this instinct that this is a political theater, like you said. That's not to say Trump might not have done something improper or asked favors from a foreign government or whatever, but I've not been a fan of his character either or his methods for a long time. But I think there's a widespread sense that what's happening here is the breakdown of our political process and the ability to even accept elections. It looks very bad for the Democrats, for instance, because I think everyone realizes they've been intent on impeaching Trump since before he took office. It's been the articles of impeachment have just had a little blank on them there for the reason for impeaching him. So that's not a healthy...
Yeah, look, that's an important point because I think that's the way that this whole thing is being received by a whole lot of Americans, is that this was inevitable. I remember before he was inaugurated, after winning the election, National Public Radio, and of course NPR is supposed to be known as the calm, right? They have the calm, soothing voices. No, they're not getting upset. They're certainly, left of center pretty dramatically on so many issues, but they're gonna, kind of walk through issues pretty calmly and straightforwardly. And I heard at least 2 or 3 different NPR programs dedicated, I'm talking 30-minute podcasts that are dedicated to what would it look like either when President Trump is impeached or what will he do to get impeached? Not what might he do, but what will he do to get impeached? This is before he was even inaugurated. And I think that that's the noise that a lot of Americans are cynical about is, you've been talking about this from the very beginning. You just waited till you could wait no longer and made a political calculation about this. I don't think that this is building any faith in the mechanisms of government. And of course, we remember back, as you mentioned, Bill Clinton's impeachment hearings. That just really emboldened the fact that he was going to win re-election. For at least that was the case with Bill Clinton.
Yeah, certainly. We have to remember impeachment is sort of an indictment. It's not a conviction. So presidents can be impeached without being convicted by the Senate, removed from office. So we have to ask exactly what the fallout of this is going to be. I'm not going to predict an election, but it certainly seems like something that you could imagine helping the president win re-election. But I'll tell you what, to bring this back just real quick to a worldview level here, since that's what we're doing on this show, There was a great article by Matt Taibbi in Real Clear Politics. I think it's how you say his name. And it was called "We're in a Permanent Coup." And Matt hails from Russia, and he was just sort of drawing on his experience in the early 90s watching the Soviet Union fall apart and the KGB coup that was attempted against Gorbachev. And he says, look, guys, the language I'm hearing right now out of Washington, the news cycle in America right now, it sounds a whole awful lot like what I remember from Russia and what others who have grown up in third world countries and the sort of banana republic style governments remember. And it's not something you want. You don't want to live in a permanent coup in a place where there's never an admission of legitimacy in the government, where every election is contested by, police forces and criminal trials and maneuverings. So, I mean, we can be grateful that we have not up until this point lived in that kind of country, but what's happening right now has consequences. And I don't think this is a road we want to go down. I think he's right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, earlier this week, we talked about DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Of course, this was signed into law by President Obama, and it essentially granted the 700,000 immigrants who arrived in the U.S. as minors, gave them temporary protection from deportation, but basically kind of an ongoing every 2 years check-in with the government sort of thing. Back early in his presidency, President Trump issued basically an executive order killing DACA and giving Congress basically a short amount of time in order to come up with some sort of solution for these children. And of course, we all know what happened with that. Summary, nothing. And this has gone back and forth and back and forth. Now, we made 2 points on a Breakpoint commentary this past week, and I want to go back and revisit them because I think that you could see this underpinning underneath the impeachment hearings as well. First point that we made is that one of the problems is that immigration has become a political issue. And I think what we're seeing in the impeachment hearings is how so much of American culture has become a political issue. Now, we've had some folks that wrote in and they didn't understand what that meant. And I get that because, they didn't like the language. If it goes, you have to have a political solution to this, so that makes it a political issue. But that's exactly what I'm trying not to say. I think there are economic issues. I think there are immigration issues. I think there are religious freedom issues. I think that there are all kinds of issues. But when politics stops being a process and the rules of politics become the means by which we understand, think through, and determine our position on issues, that's where we've got a problem. Because what we're seeing here is just, I think this is what that article talking about the impeachment hearings is saying, Shane, is that when things just become a political football, when everything gets put through the rules of politics, then things get understood by whoever can finally get the final lever on power. That's not a politics that actually moves the needle forward for human flourishing or moves the needle forward for understanding the best way to order our lives together. Yeah, there's a pragmatic side to politics. There's a power side to politics. But we should think through both immigrants and citizens and laws and rights on their own terms, first and foremost, put those things in place, and then kick around on a political level how to best get to a level of compromise and a position forward. And that was the point, is that DACA has become such a political football, and it just goes back and forth. And we go from this executive order to that executive order and back and forth. It's hard to see in any sense that the Supreme Court's going to, quote unquote, settle this issue in any way that's going to have a long-term impact. And it's going to help us actually deal with what we have, which is a really, really big problem, which how do we understand human dignity at the same time understanding rules of law that we have in America and a southern border that's far too porous? How do we put all of this stuff together? And I'm not sure that the current process is going to get us there.
Well, you said this is a political football, and that's right, but we got to remember the people getting kicked around are real human beings. What you said on Breakpoint really nailed it, that it never should have come to this. And I also think that it was right to point out that this is the result, John, at least partly on both sides of the parties being controlled by their most extreme factions. I've watched those on the left in just the last few years shift from this kind of really mainstream call for common sense immigration reform, and, they were still saying secure borders, like you said a moment ago, to this almost reflexive kind of open borders mentality, just a no to whatever Republicans propose. And the right has undergone the same kind of radicalization, I think, where, a poll by Pew Research earlier this year, for instance, found that white evangelicals, that's us, are the least likely group to support accepting refugees. And that's something we've talked about on Breakpoint before. And I think it's maybe this knee-jerk reflexive reaction to anything that sounds like open borders. That's not only is that not healthy, John, but that's inhumane. Remember, we're talking about 700,000 people who are here under the DACA program, or the DACA policy, rather, whose futures are at stake now, and they're here through no fault of their own. Whatever solution we come up with for this, and I like that John Roberts, the Chief Justice, sort of signaled in this direction during the oral arguments, whatever solution we come up with here has to be implemented in a humane way, because it's not their fault.
Yeah, and that's what we were trying to communicate to in the Breakpoint commentary. And the second point we made is, so what should we do? I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody knows. I don't think there's a quick, easy solution, because there's not a long-term solution until we back up and think about it along these lines. We talk about people as people, both citizens and immigrants. We talk about the rules of law as if there is such a thing as a rule of law. And until we get to that point, there's not going to be a long-term, easy, well, here's the decision the Supreme Court can make and it'll quote-unquote settle the issue. Just like there wasn't on the issue of abortion, just like there hasn't been on the issue of same-sex marriage. If we don't think about these things on their own terms, we're never going to get there. Hey, look, come to breakpoint.org. We'll link you to the commentary this week that we released on DACA. And I hope it's helpful. I know it's not always helpful to get to the end of a whole long, 3.5-minute explanation of something and end with I don't know what we should do. But I think so many people don't know, first of all, what are the details of DACA? If you just kind of follow politics from one political party's perspective or another political party's perspective, it's either a great thing or a terrible thing. And you don't even really know what it is we're talking about. And we tried to provide that level of detail, and hopefully that's helpful. And also kind of get to the root of kind of how politics should operate and how it should not operate. And I hope that Christians can be a redemptive force. None of this is to denigrate the political process at all. It's not only an important process, it's a necessary process, and it can be a good process. It can take us down the line to human flourishing, but we don't see a whole lot of that in our context right now. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources. And you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, I want to go from the U.S. drama to international drama, and we've got some serious situations that are developing. One, of course, that's been happening for quite a long time. What's the protests in Hong Kong? And I want to begin with those. But we also had reports this week, and somewhat close to home, having just been in Israel really a week ago. One of my coworkers wrote and goes, "Hey, I'm glad you were in Israel last week and not this week." Kind of being in the southern part of Israel, and everything seemed fine just a week ago, and now we've got rockets coming in from Gaza after the assassination of an Islamic Jihad commander. We'll get to that in just a second. Let's start with Hong Kong. We've been talking about this now for months because these protests have gone on since a proposed extradition treaty from mainland China that Hong Kong residents protested. And that extradition treaty was pulled back. Hong Kong protesters have not pulled back, really I think they've reached a point where they feel like, look, it's either the future of our democracy or we're going to go down fighting. And I think that as we watch this thing, first of all, this is escalated, and it's escalated to a new level of violence. We have reported deaths. We've got China-backed police that are being accused of terrorist-like tactics. Neither side on this is going to back down. And I think that we look at it as Americans and expect either China or the protesters to kind of grow weary and to back off, and that this will eventually de-escalate like we see, in Portland. We're not going to see that here as far as I can see. And I really pray for the protesters because, look, this could be another Tiananmen Square incident. Given what we know about the Chinese military, this is not going to de-escalate.
Yeah, one of our coworkers this week said that the longer this goes on, the less he can see it having a bloodless resolution, a peaceful resolution. This is just, it looks like the development of a terrible and potentially deadly situation here. The scenes out of like Chinese University, for example, they look like something out of Les Miserables. I mean, there's barriers going up, students waiting for police to arrive with tear gas and potentially worse. There was this moving article in The Atlantic that reminded me of what you just said, John, about the determination on both sides and about what the protesters are actually out to accomplish. It was this writer went and spoke with some of the protesters, and she was kind of embedded with them for several days in the midst of the protest, and during the tear gas and so forth, and watching the clashes with police. And the takeaway was that the people of Hong Kong truly see this as an existential crisis. They see this as their way of life and their freedoms on the line. She talks with this one pair of student protesters who kind of admit they're, afraid of the crackdowns. They realize they could actually be killed. But they told her, in essence, look, this is our only chance. China is trying to assert its authority to swallow up Hong Kong and take away the liberties we cherish and that we inherited from the British. And they specifically mentioned what China has done to the Uyghurs, for example, and how those who silently go into the night of communist totalitarianism never seem to come out. And the sentiment they expressed was basically, we might as well go down fighting, even though we don't really have much hope here. So it's stunning to see that, John. And as we've mentioned before on Breakpoint this week, this is, at its essence, a clash of worldviews, right? It's a clash of two ways of seeing rights and liberty and human beings and what it means to be free and to prosper.
Yeah, it is. And it's also a clash of worldviews, though, between those of us here watching it over there. I think we're looking at this through kind of Western prosperity sort of eyes and not seeing the seriousness over there. I mean, so there's this kind of viral video of a U.S. tourist in Hong Kong yelling at protesters and basically saying, what are you doing? You should be thankful for the safety that you have, and it's not worth it to die, and so on and so on and so on. And in her comment, that's what brought to my mind, like, she just doesn't get, first of all, the seriousness of communism and especially this communist Chinese government. And she certainly doesn't get basically that there's something more important than safety. In other words, I think we look at it. I think so many have said, and I remember, and I've read tons of articles saying, "Look, China's not really going to crack down on Hong Kong because of the financial benefit." But see, we're looking at that.
The goose that laid the golden egg.
Yeah, that's right. And we would say, well, that would make no sense, because we would say, well, financial benefit is more important than power, and so eventually the Chinese government is going to back down. Are you kidding me? China doesn't have a 1 year perspective on this. They don't have what's the stock market going to do by the end of the week if we do this? Many of us don't think more long term than just that. China has a dynasty perspective on this. They will sacrifice short-term financial loss because of long-term power play. They absolutely will do that. And on the other hand, I think that this is something that the Hong Kong protesters get to. I think we'd look at them and say, well, you got what you wanted. The extradition treaty was pulled back. It's okay. Look, this was supposed to be a 50-year agreement that didn't even last 30 to allow Hong Kong to operate independently. The way that initial agreement was developed when Britain turned Hong Kong back over to the Chinese. They understand that with the way the Chinese government is proceeding, the way that they're removing all dissent, both political, religious, worldview, anything else, the way that they're persecuting minorities, the way that they're willing to crack down, the way that they're willing to, basically to say, we're not going to just go in and run this over, but eventually, this is going to come to a head, and if the world condemns us, the world condemns us. We're on our own. I mean, we just do not have that sort of perspective to be able to think about this situation the way that it actually is escalating. And the only way you can really understand it is to understand the power of worldview. If you think people are fundamentally economically shaped or economically determined, if you think that people just act the way they do out of a desire for survival, that's what was stunning about that piece, which, by the way, we'll link to at breakpoint.org, is that there are people still in the world. And by the way, many Americans used to be the sort of people as well that will say, I will fight for this cause or I will die trying. And we just don't have that perspective. And that's what I saw from this U.S. critic of these protesters. They just literally do not understand how deeply held beliefs about life in the world will allow a conflict like this to escalate to this degree. That's what we're seeing over there. And that's why I think it's getting hotter and hotter. And we need to continue to pray because there's going to be a lot of bloodshed, I fear.
Yeah, the incredible irony, John, is that communism as an ideology is supposed to be based on the idea that we're all economic creatures, but China is willing to just eschew the economic side of it and make these short-term sacrifices in service of what they see as their long-term political good, because they see this as an existential struggle too, every bit as much as the residents of Hong Kong, because they know if someone is allowed to challenge them and defy their system and push them around, then it's all going to come tumbling down. We talked about the fall of the Soviet Union last week, John, and that was very much along the same lines, that sort of thing. China views this as a threat to their authority and power and existence. And it's easy for us to forget as Americans what this sort of situation is like. Our forebears went to war against a government that was significantly less tyrannical than China is right now. That's astonishing to think that the war in 1776 happened over, the complaints that Thomas Jefferson lists in the Declaration of Independence. And none of those look like something on the same scale, John, as what the people of Hong Kong have suffered. And then especially those in mainland China, religious and cultural minorities who've been persecuted.
Yeah, it really just you kind of wonder how much God does watch over the affairs of men, because these things are so vulnerable. I mean, moving on to the story happening and developing in Israel right now. I mean, look, I was just there again a week ago. There was no sense that we were in any danger, that there was any sort of flare up that's about to happen. And, kind of moments later, Israel, and of course, we all know that Israel doesn't mess around. They don't sit and wait for a threat to become actualized. They went in and took out the leader of the Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and then Gaza militants started to bombard southern Israel with rockets. I had a friend that was flying out of Tel Aviv, basically saying, I'm glad we were able to get out. Now, I don't think it's going to escalate to an all-out war, but it does tell you how fragile the human condition is, how fragile our life together is, how important it is that we deal with truth. And that goes back to the things that we were talking about in the first segment. Well, we got one more story that we want to get to. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, I want to get to one more story because I was just made aware of something that really surprised me this week. And I've been a bioethics junkie for quite some time, particularly the issue of stem cells. I don't know if you remember the John Kerry presidential campaign where he basically promised that if embryonic stem cell funding was allowed and that research was really funded to a new level by the government, then I remember he actually said people like Christopher Reeves would get up and walk again. And he put guys like Michael J. Fox front and center. And there was these utopian promises. Well, he lost that election. George W. Bush won that election, and he vetoed a funding bill and basically said the government's not going to fund any stem cell research that leads to the destruction of an embryo. Now, what that meant is that funding lines opened up for what we call adult stem cells. These are stem cells that are acquired without having to kill an embryo. Now, move forward to the Obama presidency, even though the adult stem cell research that was being done was reaping all kinds of treatments and benefits, and the embryo-destructive stem cell research, which was still receiving private funding, was giving us nothing. President Obama opened up an entire line of funding for embryo-destructive stem cell research. He overturned basically the Bush-era policy. 8 years later, guess what we had? We still had enormous advances that were made in adult stem cells, even though I remember World Magazine, for example, doing stories covering the fact that, adult stem cells have all this promise, like they're actually leading to treatments, and we can't get federal funding. Embryo-destructive stem cell research was getting all kinds of funding under President Obama, and guess what? Still no treatments. There are currently...
Bubkiss.
Currently 0 treatments that are actually in play after all 8 years of Obama-era funding. Now, basically, I've said this a number of times from the stage. George W. Bush, whatever you think of his presidency, he got this one exactly right. He nailed it. This was exactly right. I just found out this past week that President Trump has not ended federal funding for embryo-destructive stem cell research. And I was really surprised by that. I mean, you and I have talked about this, and we've talked about this before. President Trump has done an enormous amount of things for the pro-life cause. Not everything, but he has done far more than a whole lot of other presidents, including so-called pro-life presidents, for the pro-life cause. I was stunned to find out that there's still federal funding going to embryo-destructive stem cell research right now.
Yeah, this is a call imminently worth making, John. I mean, I remember, you may not believe it, but I actually was in high school during the 2004 presidential campaign, and I can remember John Kerry making these grandiose promises. And I think maybe the ongoing inability to get over embryonic stem cell research in terms of federal funding is just because of that. It was because of the utopia-like promises that were made, that the blind were going to see, the deaf were going to hear, and the lame were going to walk again. It was like the second coming of Christ. And none of it materialized, like you said. Whereas with adult stem cells, which are, have been deprived of a great deal of funding, have shown a lot of promise, and we've seen a number of critical breakthroughs, like the ability to induce pluripotency in that. I mean, that was all the way back in 2006. So this is something that sort of dropped off the table for some reason. We did a commentary a couple of years ago called The Late Great Stem Cell Debate, about how essentially one side was right, that we didn't need embryonic stem cells. And you said, I loved what you said at the end of that commentary, even if embryonic stem cells were yielding miracle cures, we still shouldn't do it because it's unethical. You're destroying human life at the earliest stages of development. But what we have now are these thousands of applications for adult stem cells, thanks to the ability to make them behave like embryonic cells. And I think, it's time. It's high time to end federal funding for embryonic research. The kind of thing, it's also the kind of thing this administration has a record of listening to. So, let's get out there with the megaphone and remind President Trump, hey, we're still funding this. We should stop.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, listen, there's obviously not an ethical reason to destroy embryos. There's not a scientific reason. There's not a pragmatic, but it'll work sort of reason. We actually now can take cells and turn them backwards and make them behave like embryonic stem cells without destroying an embryo to get the stem cells, not to mention adult stem cells are now treating over 80-some conditions. And that's therapies that are actually in play, not even those that are still in the testing phase. We'll come to breakpoint.org. We'll give you a lot more information on the difference between adult stem cells and embryonic stem cells, this commentary, the late great stem cell debate. It should be a dead issue. This is one of the things where we can say the science is settled. But we don't say these sorts of things, but that's another conversation for another time. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll link you to various resources on the topics that we talked about in today's program. And thanks for joining us as we have a conversation about the culture each and every week here from a Christian worldview. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. See you next time.